But what really is blocking progress is the data, what I like to call like a connection economy. Excellent then is not an act, but a habit. And that's like how you create the breakthroughs. So yeah, I think it's like a very exciting time to be alive.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inference podcast by Turing Post. I'm very happy to welcome Ulrik Hansen, president and co-founder of Encord. Welcome, Ulrich.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a big question. If intelligence is solving tasks under uncertainty, what is still holding us back? And some people would say it's models. Some people say it's inference. What's your take?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and something that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about. And from our vantage point, we work with more than 200 of the world's top AI teams. It really comes down to the data. So that was the original founding insight for starting Encord, that the thing that wins in AI and the things that is actually constraining progress is principally down to the data and like orchestrating the data to get the models working in production. Because if you think about the different ways that AI is being deployed now, the models themselves are mostly swappable and interchangeable. And I think in the vast majority of cases that we see, at least, the models are for the most part good enough to add tremendous value to whatever it is that you're trying to solve. But what really is blocking progress even further is the data. And so I think what's hard is getting the data orchestrated and enriched to provide enough context to the model or the system you're building via training, inference, or otherwise, and getting it to like make the right decisions based on data. Data is really the higher part. And it's almost like if you think about being a human being, right, you can't really make sound decisions and judgments with incomplete data. So you might be slightly smarter as a person. You might have a slightly better model, but if you don't have the right data, you're not going to get very far.
Well, you started Encord in very different times in 2021. What's changed when ChatGPT went public for you as a company?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because we started the company like principally focused on like automating the annotation process. So like at the time, the problems that people have were principally around like solving the data quantity problems, just like getting enough labeled training data to be able to like train these like base models. And of course, like with the proliferation and like the massive improvements we've seen in language models over the past year, and also like in AI more broadly, like we've seen the problem space change from doing like bounding box annotation to now like all the frontier labs are hiring PhDs to do like very frontier type work to continuously improve the models. I think that like generally comes with just like us like moving further up like the scaling law curve, right? So we've like gone from like data quantity to data quality is like getting the right data. So now like the sort of post-training and alignment types of problems for the most advanced areas of AI. And as the models generally have gotten smarter, each incremental unit of progress has become harder. And I think like language models and self-driving, I think the two most mature areas of AI, we see that right front and center. And so the space has evolved from like, again, like the bounding box annotation into like hiring the PhDs. And I think for self-driving, it's like finding all the long tail edge cases. And that is really what is necessary to kind of push the next frontiers of AI. And we're seeing that also in like other areas. Like now we're seeing it at robotics, where like robotics probably is now where like where language models were in like 2017, 2018, where like we're seeing like massive improvements to the baseline, which I think we're likely to see over the next couple of years. But at some point, the curve like asymptotes, right? And then like we start moving into like these more like esoteric types of problems and tasks. And that's where like most of the future work will be directed. And I think we see scaling laws at like many different parts of AI, right? And we've sort of like followed that journey like since pre-ChatGPT launched. So like now we work with some of the world's top AI teams in like how they've evolved that as well. So yeah, it's super exciting to be on the sidelines to like witness how this stuff is evolving.
Well, give me some example of like what was the most challenging things recently.
So you're taking an example for self-driving, for example. I think one of the main challenges that they have, right? So if you take Waymo as an example, they are like now live in San Francisco, but they haven't yet expanded to cover the geography all the way to San Francisco airport. So now the question is like, why is that, right? Like, why don't you have like fully unsupervised self-driving, given that it works so well in downtown SF? And it is really like down to real environments being dynamic and they change, and eliminating like all the different types of edge cases that the car might encounter in the real world is extremely difficult. And so you need to like basically factor that into the way that you build like your whole data orchestration pipeline, so that when the car like encounters like a new type of like unseen scenario that you have like either like a heuristic to have the car solve that problem itself, or you have some way of like relaying the feedback back into the model. And I think that's something that Tesla is doing really well, right? Because they have now supervised self-driving, and like I have a test myself. When I'm driving the car, like sometimes I have to intervene, and that data is sent directly back to Tesla. So they build this like iterative feedback loop between like, okay, actually solving the long tail as it happens. Whereas like, of course, like these like robo taxis and like unsupervised types of use cases, much more difficult because they're relying on using their own drivers, right? To like go and collect that data. So yeah, that would be one example. Yeah, go ahead.
These are two very different strategies. If we talk about Waymo and Tesla, because Tesla relies basically solely on computer vision and machine learning. So what's your bet? Because I just published a little video about self-driving, and I was recording video while Tesla was driving me around. So yeah, what's your take? Do you think Tesla's strategy with more data, with more learning will win, or Waymo more like, step-by-step careful approach from a data perspective?
Yeah, no, I think the one thing that like Tesla really has going for them is they just have a huge and compounding data advantage over basically like every single other player in the market. They are collecting live human feedback data. They have like the equivalent of like a thumbs up and a thumbs down button that you're used to in ChatGPT, right? Embedded in the cars because they have people driving the cars. And so like this data advantage is like compounds massively over time. Whereas like Waymo, they have to rely on like collecting their own data, right? They don't have like the distribution advantage that Tesla has. So inevitably, like I think that's a much slower rollout and a much slower build. Like that being said, of course, like they've sort of decided to add additional sensors on top of, as you pointed out, like Tesla's relying on RGB, additional sensors to help inform the planning and trajectories of like how the car like drives and operates, which I think quote unquote like should be a safer option, but of course is way more expensive and like takes longer to build. I am like very bullish on Tesla actually like getting ahead on this, and now they're starting to of course like roll out their own like robo taxi fleet, which they can probably like do very quickly. Now the question is they of course like probably don't have the same advantage or like the same lead with working with the regulators that Waymo has. So I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to observe over the next like 3 to 5 years as like these systems actually like go live in like the different cities around the US.
Do robotics have the same bottlenecks as autonomous systems like self-driving, or it's different?
Yeah, no, I think they have a lot of the same constraints. So I think ultimately the difficulty in deploying like these like robotic systems is like you have the additional constraints of you have to deploy the model on like specific like hardware devices on edge, right? So you have GPU constrained environments that you don't have if you're leveraging a foundation model like a chat interface. You have to first and foremost like make sure that like your systems can actually work on these like embodied AI devices, which is, I think, no small feat of engineering. And then like creating the iterative feedback loop between the actual product usage and the model itself is also much, much harder because you might have like a robot folding laundry in your house and it might fail. So now look at, okay, how do you relay that back into like the system and like how it's trained? It becomes like, there's of course like latency for like uploading the data. You might like be in like an area without like Wi-Fi, so you don't necessarily have internet connectivity. Whereas like where we have seen the fastest progress in AI has been like in the pure digital workflows, right? So for language models like ChatGPT and otherwise or coding, where like the feedback loop between like the actual user and the model itself is instant. That's not a luxury that you have in physical and embodied AI. So the companies that are building in those types of domains, like they have to really think carefully about like how they collect that feedback. And we see it like being solved in a number of different ways. Like some companies are adding teleoperations to like help steer the robot if they kind of go off the rails. But ultimately, like if you want them to work on a fully autonomous basis, right, you don't necessarily like will be able to rely on that. So being clever about like how you build those like feedback loops is going to be what determines a lot of the future compounding advantage.
Feedback loops, we will see more and more of that in AI agentic systems, right? How does infrastructure evolve to address that?
Yeah, that's a great question and something we've thought a lot about because we are like building a key part of like that infrastructure that makes like the human feedback possible. I think what we've seen like generally over the last couple of years is like the companies have evolved from building like out the kind of core foundations of like the models that they've been building, and like as they go live in production, then like building the human feedback infrastructure like becomes much more important. And per use case, right, like you have to have a lot of like custom tooling. So if you're building like a model that can work with like LiDAR or 3D data or like video data, you need like good tools And like the whole like AI tool chain, like it's just very much like in development, right? Like a lot of this stuff like hasn't really been built yet. So like we'll see that happening over the next like I think 5 to 10 years. If you think about like how the internet economy has been built over the last 30 years, the development life cycle has like gotten to where we are now. I think AI is likely to be much more, it will happen on a much more compressed timeline. And yeah, of course, like we're kind of like one of the companies that are building in that space, us alongside like other ones. What that tool chain will look like exactly, I think it will probably look like a lot of the functionality that we have in software development. So like version control systems, like we have like good networking protocols and all these things. We will have to build out like similar things for AI specifically. But the interesting quirk about AI systems is that it becomes a little bit more difficult to do because they are like dynamic, right? And they're sort of like working in a real environment and like not constrained to the same environments that like software are working in, which are like inevitably like much more programmatic.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainty to deal with.
100%.
You were talking about involving more PhD students for annotation, working with data. So if expert feedback is the new gold, what is the role of humans in this? Is it like coexisting task with agents? Are humans just callable functions in the system? Who are humans here?
Yeah, no, I think ultimately like the humans will be providing human preference and feedback to the AI systems. And I think that will happen in like many different ways. So let's like maybe take like two examples. One example would be you with your personal AI digital assistant. You will provide feedback to that digital system, like how you like to, I don't know, like when do you like to wake up in the morning? Like what do you like to have for breakfast? And like that will continuously like learn based on like the human preference data that you give it. So that's like on the more consumer side. And I think that's already happening in ChatGPT, right? Where like the model is kind of getting personalized based on how much context that you've fed it. And I think that's some of the things that the Frontier Labs are working on is really like giving like the models as much context as you can from like your personal human preference data. It will like be able to offer like more and more customized advice and like be more of like an assistant to you. I think in the enterprise and like more on the kind of commercial side, all human experts now are like really people that are like doing their day-to-day jobs. So if you're like let's say an investment banking analyst at like a big investment bank, you are like doing the work. AI will be observing like what you're doing. And so you are like quote unquote like human expert that are providing feedback to the model, like how like certain workflow processes and all these things should like operate. And I think as like AI is kind of getting pushed into the enterprise, that's something that is likely to, of course, like become more and more like prevalent as like you will be at work constantly providing feedback and like work with AI to like do your job essentially. So it's happening both in like the rollout of AI, but also happening, of course, like we discussed before, at the kind of pure training layer for pushing the frontiers of like the models where like we've started like seeing the asymptote. And that is, you know, what the Frontier Labs are doing behind the PhDs and the human experts to like make the base foundation models like better so that like you have to do less customization in the future. And really the human role will be just providing feedback on like the areas of uncertainty of the model, or it will be for giving like human preference on like how you like to get things to be done. Because like the model naturally will not necessarily understand like what you like to do or like how you like to do things. And that's something that will also become like way more important.
From what you're saying, it feels like that we're moving from model-centric machine learning, then it was data-centric, and now it's task-centric or even context-specific machine learning. Do you agree with this evolution?
Yeah, 100%. And I think at the end of the day, the model that we will see going forward is that, you know, the AI will propose something where like the human can verify or escalate certain things, where the machines will handle the baseline grunt work, right? Or the 80% of like the work, but then the expert, which would be like the human, like let's say the investment banking analyst will be owning the edge cases or providing the preference or providing calls on like what the policy of the model should be. And so I think the way that like the system should be designed, right, is for allowing complementarity between humans and AIs, that like the AI will allow for edits, ask for rationales, like they will surface the uncertainty where like it's not sure about certain things, and you kind of incentivize the model to find mistakes in like how it's operating. And of course, like we need all the tools and the systems, right, to be able to measure the systems. So all the throughput, the cost, and the risk of this stuff is like the feedback starts to compound.
There is a bunch of competitors in this field in terms of data labeling. How do you see this area evolving? What would the role of companies like Encord?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think you can broadly like think about the market that we are in like two different buckets. So there are like the services first companies, and then there are like the tooling software first companies. So the services first companies, they principally work on like supplying and finding human experts to do the expert work, right? That typically most often works with the frontier labs because the companies that actually work on those things. And then like for the software companies, they principally like sell all the tooling and the infrastructure to enable the first part. And I think for us, right, we principally work with Applied AI, Fortune 500, other types of enterprises on like actually enabling that thing. They are unlikely in most scenarios to like be building their own foundation models. They typically like take the stuff that is off the shelf and then they fine tune it based on like their own preference data. So whereas like the services companies principally go after the hyperscalers, the software companies typically go after the companies that are bringing the models from the hyperscalers or like putting them into production or like taking an open source model. And so like we are focused principally on like software, working with enterprise, Fortune 500 and applied AI companies, whereas like the services companies generally tend to focus on the hyperscalers and the frontier labs with like a different USP, which is like finding the people to do the work, whereas like we provide the software to do the work.
So the deal between Meta and Scale falls into the category of...
Yeah, I mean, I would probably like put them into the category on like they like I think Scale's built a fantastic business, right? Selling into the hyperscalers principally. It's hard to say exactly what's going to happen after the acquisition. I think there's been a lot of chatter around what will happen exactly. I don't know, but I think Scale has applied human experts to Meta for like a long period of time. I probably see that continuing going forward, but it is a different market that they're serving to like what the kind of software first companies are serving. So you could think about like the analogy of like Databricks or like a Snowflake. They rarely settle into the hyperscalers, right? They like have more of like a core enterprise focus on like selling to enterprise companies. They don't necessarily sell to the digital natives, like the big FAANG companies, because they tend to build their own stuff in-house. It's just a question of like, what market are you going after? And some companies are going after the services market and like providing the human experts. Like some companies like ours, we're going after the actual like enterprise use cases.
Do you think there will be more acquisitions in the upcoming year of data labeling companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously like AI is like very new, right? And I think the market like is consolidating, and data is like a very crucial ingredient for AI development. If you think about like the three ingredients for AI development: models, compute, and data. Data is like where all of the IP and all the proprietary information comes from. Going back to the initial point, right, is really like you cannot really do anything or build a custom AI system without like actually having context on whatever it is that you're solving necessarily. And so I think the market now has like kind of coalesced around the idea that data is extremely important. It is ultimately the only thing that the models can replicate. And so, yeah, it is like vital that the companies that do want to build defensible AI systems, that they have good data infrastructure, access to data, and all the rest of it.
So context is coming from people. And what about synthetic data? It seems to be everywhere now for edge cases, rare classes, bootstrapping new domains. Do you think it helps to bridge the gap, or like where does it work and where does it fall short?
Yeah, good question. So I think the areas like where we generally tend to see synthetic data working really well is like where you could do physics-based simulation. So like environments like where you can like build some sort of like model of the world, and you can like build some like stochasticity into the model, and like you kind of like simulate these like real world environments. I think that's been working really well in self-driving, where you can like simulate some of these like long tail edge cases that would be very, very hard to capture in the real world. I think like where it's falling short is generally like when you are using a model to generate synthetic data, and then maybe like generating synthetic data and then like having another model trained on that data that is already seen. So that can sometimes lead to like model collapse, because it's kind of like the snake eating its own tail. But you can also use like a bigger model to train a smaller model. So there are like different ways of like doing it. I think the most successful companies are the ones that use the human or real world data in conjunction with synthetic data. And I see that like being the winning formula going forward.
The hybrid method.
That's right.
From what I understand, you work with high stakes domains like medical AI and robotics, autonomous systems, right? What are the biggest mistakes that these companies do from prototype to production in terms of dealing with data?
I think like the most of like the very savvy companies that we work with, like they broadly understand like what their shortcomings are and like what their like shortfalls on like the infrastructure side would be. And like, of course, like they are working very hard to eliminate those. I think like at the end of the day, the challenge that like companies always have is like they don't necessarily have access to the same resources as like the frontier labs and the hyperscalers. So of course, like we're plugging that gap, right, with like building the tools and the infra that is really like only been available to the labs, and like making that available to the enterprise so that they can move as fast as like the frontier labs on like building performant AI systems.
So you are their like guide basically in this scenario?
Yeah, we're the guide, and like we, of course, like have built a product that helps them like bring the models from prototype into production, like doing that faster than they would have if they had like tried to like build a lot of the stuff in house. And a lot of times, like it's also just not feasible because the complexity of AI systems being developed, I think, is only really going one way, right? Like you wanted to solve increasingly complex types of tasks and problems, and so there is like a never-ending and evolving need to continue to push the frontiers of your own AI models and systems. So like one thing we've seen, for example, is like all the models have gone from being unimodal to being multimodal. That like opens up like a whole new set of things that you need to like be able to support. It's just not like attainable for like a Fortune 500 enterprise, similar to like how the move to the cloud, because of all the companies that had like previously built in-house data centers and infrastructure. Now they can like rely on like a cloud platform, which means that they can like move a lot faster on building in-house apps and all these other things. I think the same thing will happen in AI development.
That's very interesting. Everything that we were talking about is on a very practical level. Are there any conversations about AGI with the companies you work with, or what your personal take on it?
There are like, of course, like the companies that are working on AGI. And like my general sense is like, so we principally work on like more applied AI use cases where they try to actually bring that intelligence into production. At the end of the day, like treating intelligence as a single construct is difficult because there's like different levels of intelligence, right? There's like the cheap types of intelligence, which is just like raw knowledge and facts where like the models can like spit out infinite versions of something at like near zero cost. There's like pattern recognition on like common things like writing boilerplate code, summarizing documents, and like generating standard designs. All that stuff is like quite not easy to do. It's been a lot of time development. But I think there will be a kind of like bifurcation of like expensive and cheap intelligence. So like the expensive types of intelligence are things like human agency, creativity, original insight, taste, and vision. And the stuff that like feels like it's like genius or original because it can't be reverse engineers from the data. And so I think the kind of going back to the analogy around having AI systems that evolve and like kind of like doing both of those things, like the ones where like we can do it for cheap, there'll be less need for like a human in the loop and fact checking, but like the things that are like will be more difficult or require like more expensive types of intelligence, like that's really where like human agency, taste, and all these things that you can't really explain necessarily like in data will become like more important.
Yeah, for me, applied AI seems much more exciting than the conversations about something.
At the end of the day, like I think like a lot of the models themselves are like good enough, right? So like the main constraint now really is to like embed those models and like kind of wrapping them into products that can like solve real problems. So I think like that's where the main constraint is, because like the form factor like matters a lot, right? ChatGPT can help you write emails and all these other things, but you can't like necessarily have it do your whole like job for you. Like, of course, like these things are getting better, but there'll be like a long tail of like different types of like human tasks and work that at least like for a substantial amount of time will be like outside like the remit of like what the existing form factors that AI is like delivered in can support.
In this world where you work with data on all the stages, you know how it works in pre-training, you know how it works in post-training, and what it needs for the context, working with high-stakes companies when it's super important to really manage your data well and be safe about it. What concerns you the most in this world that you help building, and what excites you the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. The concerns that like people have around like AI and like making sure that AI is like deployed like safely and all those things, like a lot of those concerns like are warranted because there are like real risks with AI systems, right? We're seeing that kind of come out in a few different ways. There's like the mass produced like misinformation and like all those other things, which I think like we will just need like a good way of like verifying whether something is like AI generated or has been created by a human. But that's also why I think the value of brands will be even more important in the future, because you know that like if a specific brand is like a trusted source, like you go and like read the Financial Times or the Economist, I trust that like they are as objective as they can be in like their assessment of like the truth.
But they have responsibility.
But they have responsibility, exactly. And so I think that will like happen across like every single part of the economy, like the value of brands will go up a lot because of like the general kind of trust and safety issues of AI. So that is just like one thing that I don't think that there's like a good solution to, other than like it makes sense for like the existing companies that are doing these things to like continue investing in their brand, make sure that they know that they can be like the trusted source of things. I think like the excitement is also like on the flip side, right? Like the opportunity that we have and like living at this time of history, we're like likely to see more change from technology in like the next 10 years than we've seen in the last like 50 years. And so seeing like what comes out of that, I think is going to be like very exciting. I think like the models will start to kind of work in conjunction with humans to come up with like new drugs that can like treat disease in like new different ways that we had never like encountered before. A lot of like the chores from our daily life will be easier because we will have robots in our house, right? That can like do a lot of the stuff that you don't necessarily want to do. Humans will sort of like, it's an interesting point because like we will kind of like go back to, we will be doing the things that like we find to be most valuable as humans, right? So it'll be things like spending time with our family and friends and whatnot. So we're moving from like an intelligence economy where like value has accrued to intelligence over the last like 30 years into like more of what I like to call like a connection economy, where like the value that would be delivered and like there will be new jobs, right? Like the new like kind of professions created in the agrarian economy 150 years ago. It was unthinkable that there'd be such a profession as like a software engineer. And I think we'll see like a similar like proliferation of like new types of work and like new types of jobs that humans will be doing in the future that we can't even like conceive of at this point. So yeah, I think it's like a very exciting time to be alive.
I'm ready for all of that. And my last question will be about books. I always ask this question. I believe that books shape people. And what is a book or idea that shaped your thinking? And it can be related or completely unrelated to AI and machine learning.
Yeah, I've read so many like good books over the years. Like it's hard to like pinpoint exactly which one has like shaped my thinking the most. I think a more recent book that I've read that is like definitely like maybe like think a lot about like my own like life and like how I have developed in my career is a book called Daily Rituals: How Artists Work by Mason Curry. And so he like I think was like writing a column in like a newspaper, and then he started like writing about like the daily routines of like people. And so he kind of took that to an extreme and looked at like what would be some of the like the foremost like artists and thinkers in history. So there's like, I think maybe like 150 like different people like in the book. So I definitely encourage like people reading it, but it would include the likes of like Mark Twain, Isaac Newton, Ayn Rand. And it's super interesting reading about like the daily rituals of these people, because you realize that the insight or the art or the breakthrough, whatever it might be, right? Or like the new law of physics or whatever that they discovered were created not from a single insight, but really like from many years of grinding away and iterating on things before like they found that insight or before things actually started working. And there is just a lot of analogy, right? To like building a company. It's also like people always think that these things are like overnight successes, but the reality is like these things are like many, many years in the making. I think it kind of like correlates nicely with this quote from Aristotle, which is, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellent then is not an act, but a habit." And I think that is like definitely true for like most things, right? So doing the same thing over and over again every day, that's like how you create the breakthroughs. I think that's how the AI breakthroughs were created. That was how like every single breakthrough in the past was created. And I think that's just something that is, I think, very pertinent to like company building and research and like the new discoveries in artificial intelligence and beyond.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great lesson to learn. Thank you so much for this interview. It was fun.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sinia. Thanks for having me.